The formal diplomatic dinner was supposed to be a celebration of potential new partnerships and trade agreements. Representatives from dozens of species gathered in Nexus 7's grandest dining hall, a massive chamber with transparent walls that offered stunning views of the nearby nebula. The room buzzed with polite conversation in 100 different languages, translated by devices that hung in the air like glowing butterflies. Maya Rodriguez sat at a small table near the back, methodically working her way through what appeared to be a sandwich. The bread was some kind of alien grain that glowed faintly purple, and the filling included several ingredients that would have been lethal to most non-human species. She had discovered that her human digestive system could handle foods that other aliens considered exotic poisons, which she found convenient since it meant shorter lines at the food dispensers. The other humans at the dinner wore formal diplomatic attire and engaged in careful political conversations with their alien counterparts. Maya wore her cleanest maintenance coveralls and focused on her meal. She had been working double shifts all week to keep up with the station's aging systems, and she was hungry. The peaceful atmosphere changed when Zexthul entered the dining hall. The massive Vorthan warrior wore his most elaborate ceremonial armor, polished to a mirror shine and decorated with the skull-like trophies of defeated enemies. His entrance caused a ripple of nervous silence to spread through the room as smaller species instinctively moved away from his path. Zexthul surveyed the room with predatory yellow eyes until he spotted Maya. A cruel smile spread across his reptilian features as he began walking toward the center of the dining hall, his heavy footsteps echoing off the metal deck. Maya glanced up briefly when the conversations around her died down, noticed Zexthul heading toward what looked like a speaking platform, and returned her attention to her sandwich. The filling included something that tasted like spicy chicken mixed with cinnamon and electricity, which was oddly pleasant. Zexthul reached the center of the room and stood to his full imposing height. When he spoke, his voice carried easily to every corner of the dining hall, amplified by the room's acoustic design. "Fellow representatives of the Galactic Trade Alliance," he began, his tone formal but threatening. "We gather tonight to discuss the potential inclusion of a new species in our ancient Brotherhood of Worlds." Murmurs of agreement came from various tables, though Maya noticed that most aliens seemed more nervous than enthusiastic. She took another bite of her sandwich and wondered if the kitchens had any of that purple mustard she had tried yesterday. Zexthul's voice grew louder and more aggressive. "However, I must speak against this premature acceptance of humanity into our ranks. They have not proven themselves worthy of joining species that have earned their place through strength and honor." Captain Murphy, seated at the main diplomatic table, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The other human diplomats exchanged worried glances and began whispering urgent consultations with their translators. "The humans claim to come from what they call a death world," Zexthul continued, his claws extending as he spoke. "They speak of dangerous creatures and harsh conditions, as if these things make them strong. But I have observed their representatives, and I see only fragile pretenders who survived their world through luck and primitive cunning." Maya looked up from her meal with mild interest. It occurred to her that Zexthul was probably talking about Earth, though his description didn't sound particularly accurate. Australia was dangerous, sure, but mostly you just had to pay attention and use common sense. Zexthul began pacing in a wide circle, his movements becoming more aggressive and theatrical. "I propose that before humanity is granted membership in our alliance, they must first prove their worth through trial of combat. Let their champions face Vorthan warriors in honorable battle, and we shall see if they are truly fit to stand among the stars." This suggestion caused an immediate uproar among the assembled diplomats. Some species cheered their approval, while others voiced strong objections. The insect-like Chithan clicked their mandibles in what Maya had learned was their version of applause. The peaceful Aquari made distressed bubbling sounds and began arguing with their neighbors. Maya found the whole thing rather silly. It reminded her of the time two neighboring cattle ranchers had gotten into a dispute about water rights and spent months threatening each other instead of just sitting down and working out a reasonable sharing agreement. Zexthol raised his claws for silence, and the room gradually quieted. "But perhaps formal combat is unnecessary," he said, his yellow eyes scanning the crowd until they found Maya. "Perhaps a simple demonstration will suffice." The Vorthan warrior began walking directly toward Maya's table, his armor clanking with each step. The aliens nearby scrambled to get out of his way, overturning chairs and abandoning their meals in their haste to escape. Maya noticed the commotion and looked up to see Zexthul approaching. She sighed and took another bite of her sandwich, hoping he wouldn't take too long with whatever speech he was planning. She still had 3 more hours of work scheduled before her shift ended. Zexthul stopped directly in front of Maya's table and drew himself up to his most intimidating posture. His scales had shifted to deep green with red markings, which she had learned indicated extreme aggression in Vorthan body language. His tail lashed behind him, and his claws gleamed under the dining hall's lights. "Behold," Zexthul announced, "to the room. A representative of the mighty human race. Observe how she demonstrates the fearsome reputation of her species." Maya looked around the now silent dining hall, realized that everyone was staring at her, and gave a small wave with her free hand. "Hi there," she said cheerfully. "Don't mind me, I'm just having dinner." Zexthul's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Stand, human, and receive the traditional challenge of the Vorthan Empire." "Challenge?" Maya asked, taking another bite of her sandwich. "What kind of challenge? If it's a eating contest, I should warn you that I grew up in a house with 4 brothers. I can put away food pretty fast when I need to." The watching aliens made various sounds of shock and disbelief. A few of the braver ones had started recording the exchange, while others were placing frantic bets on the outcome. Zexthul began the formal ritual of Vorthan Challenge, a ceremony that had not been refused in over 3 centuries. He spread, his claws wide, threw back his head, and began speaking in the ancient Vorthan war tongue. The words were harsh and guttural, full of rolling consonants and sharp vowel sounds that seemed to echo with the promise of violence. Even species that didn't understand the language could feel the menace in Zexthul's voice as he recited the traditional threats and demands for submission. Maya listened politely while she finished her sandwich. The language sounded interesting, though not particularly musical. It reminded her a bit of the sound her old truck used to make when the engine was having carburetor trouble. When Zexthul finished his recitation and stood waiting for her response, Maya wiped her hands on a napkin and looked up at him with mild curiosity. "That was nice," she said. "What did it mean?" Zexthul's jaw dropped open in shock. "It was a formal challenge to mortal combat, you ignorant primitive." "Oh," Maya said, nodding thoughtfully. "Well, that seems a bit excessive. Did I do something?" "To annoy you?" The entire dining hall held its breath as they waited for Zexthul's response. The Vorthan warrior's scales had shifted to an even deeper shade of red, and his whole body was trembling with barely contained rage. "Your very existence annoys me. he snarled. "Your species dares to claim strength while displaying nothing but weakness and disrespect." Maya considered this while she gathered up the remains of her meal. "You know, you remind me of this frilled lizard I had as a pet when I was 12, she said conversationally. "Big fellow, lots of attitude, always puffing himself up and hissing at things. Turned out he was mostly show, though. Once I figured out he just wanted attention, he calmed down quite a bit." The war room on Nexus Prime had never seen such desperation before. Admiral Veltar pressed his 4 hands against the smooth metal table and tried not to show his fear to the other council members. The Galactic Council had ruled over peaceful trade and diplomacy for 3,000 years, but now everything was falling apart because of one species that refused to follow the rules of civilized warfare. The Korthak Empire had appeared from the outer rim like a storm of death and violence sweeping through star systems faster than anyone thought possible, and their bioengineered warriors tore through the finest military forces the galaxy had ever assembled. Veltar looked around the circular chamber at the other species' representatives and saw the same terror in all of their alien faces. Resonance of Truth was a crystalline being whose body normally glowed with soft blue light, but today the crystal flickered with nervous red energy. Whirlwind Speaker floated in his containment field as a swirling mass of gas and particles, but even his usual graceful movement seemed erratic and panicked. The insectoid Zixtal clicked her mandibles repeatedly, which was always a sign of extreme stress among her people. 12 star systems had fallen in 6 months, and millions of beings were dead or enslaved. The Korthak did not take prisoners in any normal sense, but instead turned captured soldiers into more bioweapons for their endless war machine. Every tactical approach the Council had tried failed completely because the Korthak fought like wild animals instead of proper military forces. They used suicide attacks and ate their enemies and carved symbols into their own flesh before battle. The worst part was that they seemed to enjoy the violence and pain which made no sense to any civilized species in the galaxy. Veltar had called this emergency meeting because their last hope was arriving today from a world that most council members preferred to forget existed. Earth was what the galaxy classified as a death world where everything tried to kill everything else, and somehow intelligent life had evolved anyway. The humans who came from this nightmare planet were relatively new to galactic politics, and most species considered them barely civilized barbarians. But rumors had reached the Council that humans had encountered the Korthak on the frontier worlds and somehow survived the experience. The massive doors to the war room opened with a soft hiss, and Veltar straightened his tall frame as he prepared to meet the human representative. Captain Jake Morrison walked into the chamber, followed by a smaller human female in a similar uniform. Morrison was typical of his species, with short brown hair and eyes that seemed to constantly scan for threats even in this supposedly safe environment. The female human was Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez, according to the files Veltar had reviewed, and she carried a metal case that looked heavy. What struck Veltar immediately was how calm both humans appeared, while every other species in the room was radiating fear and desperation. Morrison walked directly to the center of the chamber without any of the formal greetings or ceremonies that were required by galactic protocol. He simply stood there for a moment, looking at each council member in turn with those cold predator eyes that all humans seemed to possess. Then, without any warning or explanation, Morrison lifted the metal case onto the polished conference table. The sound of metal hitting crystal made every alien in the room flinch, because nothing had ever been placed on that sacred surface before. Morrison opened the case with 2 sharp clicks that echoed through the silent chamber. Veltar watched in growing Horror as the human reached into the case and pulled out something that made his blood freeze in his veins. It was a skull, but not just any skull, because this was clearly Korthak in origin, with the distinctive bone ridges and enlarged jaw structure. The skull was massive and stained with what looked like dried blood and battle damage. Morrison placed it on the table with a heavy thud that seemed impossibly loud in the absolute silence. But he was not finished because he reached into the case again and pulled out a second skull even larger than the first. This one had been cracked down the middle and showed clear signs of violent trauma. The second skull joined the first with another echoing impact. The third skull was the largest of all, and Veltar recognized the distinctive markings carved into the bone that indicated extremely high rank among the Korthak warrior hierarchy. Morrison set this final skull down with the same casual indifference he might show to placing a cup of coffee on a table. The three skulls sat there in a neat row stained with battle and death while every alien in the room stared in complete shock. But Morrison was still not done because he reached into the case one final time and withdrew a document that appeared to be written on some kind of treated hide. The document was covered in symbols that Veltar recognized as Korthak blood script, which was only used for the most sacred and binding agreements. Morrison placed this treaty next to the skulls, and finally spoke in the flat, emotionless tone that humans used for stating simple facts. These belong to your problem, and this treaty will solve it. The words hung in the air like a physical presence while every council member tried to process what they were seeing. Veltar found his voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper when he asked what the human had brought to their sacred chamber. Morrison glanced at the skulls as if he had forgotten they were there, and explained, in the same matter-of-fact tone, that they were the remains of 3 Korthak leaders. Warlord Thexmore had commanded the 3rd Assault Fleet that had destroyed the Rigel colonies. General Krixval had personally led the bioweapon attacks that poisoned. 4 Worlds War Prince Zethkar had been responsible for the massacre of the civilian population on New Geneva. All 3 were dead now, and their skulls served as proof of something the Galactic Council had thought impossible. Morrison continued explaining that humanity had been fighting the Korthak for 8 months, while the Council debated and held meetings and tried to find diplomatic solutions. The human military had taken a different approach, based on their understanding of what the Korthak actually were beneath all their bioweapons and technology. They were tribal warriors who only respected strength and dominance displayed through personal combat and ritual violence, so humans gave them exactly what they understood: the treaty written in blood script and signed with the life essence of defeated enemies, granted humanity status as apex predators in Korthak society. It established territorial boundaries and rules of engagement that the Korthak would honor, because they had been beaten by superior warriors. Morrison picked up one of the skulls and turned it over in his hands. While he waited for the council to respond, Lieutenant Rodriguez stepped forward and added that the complete tactical analysis was available for review, along with detailed reports of all human Korthak engagements. She spoke in the same calm, professional tone while surrounded by aliens who were still staring at the skulls in horror and fascination. Veltar realized that everything had changed in the space of 5 minutes. The desperate war that had seemed hopeless was apparently over and solved by the species that everyone considered the least civilized. The humans had walked into an impossible situation and simply killed their way to victory, using methods that no civilized species would even consider. Morrison placed the skull back on the table and looked directly at Veltar with those predator eyes. He asked if the council wanted to discuss the terms of galactic peace or if they preferred to continue losing the war they had been fighting so poorly. The question was delivered without any emotion or judgment, just a simple request for clarification about how they wanted to proceed. Veltar looked around the chamber at his fellow council members and saw his own confusion reflected in their alien features. Everything they thought they knew about warfare and diplomacy had just been turned upside down by a species from a death world who solved problems by killing them. The dining hall remained frozen in absolute silence for what felt like an eternity. Hundreds of alien representatives from dozens of species stared at the impossible scene before them. Zex Thul, the most feared Vorthan warrior in 3 star systems, lay motionless on the deck while Maya Rodriguez calmly adjusted her coveralls and looked around for her tool bag. The silence stretched on until it became almost unbearable. Some aliens had stopped breathing entirely, their biological systems locked in shock. Others trembled with a mixture of awe and terror as they tried to process what they had just witnessed. Maya noticed the attention and gave everyone another friendly wave. "Sorry about the noise, folks. You can go back to your dinners now." The casual dismissal seemed to break whatever spell had fallen over the room. Suddenly, the dining hall erupted in chaos as different species began reacting in their own ways. The insect-like Chithan started clicking their mandibles in rapid, excited patterns. The plant-based Verdani rustled their leaves in what their species used for applause. A group of crystalline beings began chiming like wind instruments in a symphony of amazement. Captain Murphy was the first human to reach Maya's side, his face pale with shock and something that might have been pride. "Maya," he said carefully, "do you realize what you just did?" Maya looked down at Zexthul, who was still conscious but unable to move anything below his neck. "Yeah, I gave him a good knee to the spine. Same technique I used on that big dingo that tried to get into our chicken coop last year. Works pretty well if you hit the right spot." "That was Zexthul," Murphy said slowly. "First claw of the Vorthan Empire. He's personally conquered 17 star systems. Well, maybe he should have stuck to conquering star systems instead of bothering people during dinner," Maya replied reasonably. She looked down at the paralyzed warrior with genuine concern. "I probably should call the medical bay, though. I might have hit him a little harder than I meant to." The other Vorthan delegates, who had been seated at a table near the front of the dining hall, slowly approached the scene. Their scales had shifted to pale yellow, which Maya had learned was their equivalent of shock. The largest among them, wearing slightly less elaborate armor than Zexthul, knelt beside their fallen warrior. "How?" the Vorthan asked in heavily accented English, looking up at Maya with something approaching reverence. "Did you defeat our greatest champion so easily?" Maya shrugged. "He wasn't paying attention to what I was doing. Too busy talking and showing off. Back home, we learned early that the loudest animals are usually the ones you don't need to worry about. It's the quiet ones that'll get you." She paused and looked at the assembled Vorthan delegation with mild curiosity. "Are you guys going to be a problem too? Or can we call this settled?" The Vorthans exchanged rapid conversations in their own language, their scales flickering through various colors. Finally, their apparent leader stood and performed what looked like a formal bow. "The Vorthan Empire recognizes the combat superiority of the human Maya Rodriguez. We request immediate negotiation of non-aggression treaties with your species." "Combat superiority?" Maya laughed. I'm not a fighter. I'm a maintenance tech. I just wanted him to stop making so much noise while I was eating. This statement caused another wave of amazed chatter throughout the dining hall. If Maya Rodriguez was just a maintenance worker and not even a trained human warrior, what were their actual soldiers capable of? Station Commander Veltar, a tall, insectoid Chithin who had been watching from the administrative balcony, activated the hall's communication system. All diplomatic representatives, please remain calm and return to your seats. Medical teams are en route to assist the injured party. Maya picked up her tool bag and started walking toward the exit. Well, this has been interesting, but I've got 3 more sections to check before my shift ends. The air recyclers in Section D have been making funny noises all week. Wait, called out an Aquari diplomat, their blue skin rippling with bioluminescent patterns. What should we tell our governments about this incident? Maya stopped and thought about the question seriously. I guess tell them that if they're polite and don't threaten the maintenance staff, humans are pretty easy to get along with. We're just here to do our jobs and maybe learn some new things. Captain Murphy caught up with her as she reached the dining hall exit. Maya, you do realize that everything just changed, right? The entire balance of power in this sector of the galaxy just shifted because you got annoyed during dinner. Did it? Maya asked, looking genuinely puzzled. That seems like a pretty fragile balance if one maintenance worker could shift it. Maybe they should work on making it more stable. As they walked through the station corridors, Maya noticed that the other aliens they passed were behaving differently than before. Instead of just staring and whispering, they were now backing against the walls and making what appeared to be respectful gestures. Some even seemed to be bowing. Captain, Maya said, why is everyone acting so weird? It's like they think I'm someone important or something. Murphy smiled and shook his head. Maya, you just defeated the most feared warrior in 3-star systems, using a technique you learned from dealing with farm animals. To them, you might as well be some kind of unstoppable super soldier. Maya considered this while they waited for a transport tube to their section of the station. That's silly, though. I mean, Zexthul was big and loud, but he had terrible balance. And he telegraphed his movements like crazy. Any decent fighter would have taken him down easily. But that's just it, Murphy explained. To them, he wasn't just any opponent. He was the pinnacle of Vorthan military might, and you treated him like a minor inconvenience. Over the next few hours, word of the incident spread throughout Nexus 7 faster than Maya could complete her maintenance rounds. The betting pools that had been speculating about human capabilities were replaced by urgent diplomatic communications between various species' home governments. The Chithan Collective immediately authorized their diplomats to offer humanity preferred trading status. The Aquari Federation began drafting mutual defense proposals. Even the notoriously isolationist crystalline hegemony sent messages expressing interest in cultural exchange programs. Maya remained blissfully unaware of most of this political upheaval. She spent the rest of her shift cleaning air recyclers, calibrating gravity generators, and replacing worn components in the station's communication array. The work was satisfying and straightforward, unlike the increasingly complicated behavior of everyone around her. When she finally returned to the human quarters that evening, she found Captain Murphy sitting in the common area with a dozen diplomatic messages spread out on the table in front of him. Busy day? Maya asked, grabbing a drink from the dispenser. You could say that, Murphy replied. We've received formal apologies from the Vorthan Empire, trade proposals from 6 different species, and requests for military alliance from 3 others. Oh, and the crystalline hegemony wants to know if you'd be interested in teaching their security forces your advanced combat techniques. Maya sat down across from him and took a sip of her drink. Advanced combat techniques. I just gave the guy a knee to the spine. It's not exactly rocket science. Maybe not to you, Murphy said. But to them, you just demonstrated that humans can casually defeat their most dangerous warriors without breaking a sweat. They're starting to wonder what our actual military is capable of. Maya was quiet for a moment, thinking about the day's events. You know, this whole thing reminds me of something that happened back home when I was a kid. We had this neighbor who kept bragging about how tough his new guard dog was, how it could scare off any intruder. What happened? Murphy asked. One day the dog got loose and came charging at me while I was walking to school. Big, mean-looking thing, all teeth and snarls. Everyone expected me to run screaming. Maya smiled at the memory. Instead, I just stood my ground and gave it a firm no when it got close. Turned out it was all bark and no bite. After that, nobody in town was impressed by loud, aggressive animals anymore. Murphy leaned back in his chair, understanding dawning in his eyes. And now the galaxy is starting to realize that maybe being loud and aggressive isn't as impressive as they thought it was. Maybe, Maya said. Though I still think they're making too big a deal out of this. Zexthul was just one guy having a bad day. I'm sure there are plenty of aliens out there who are actually dangerous. As if to prove her point, a soft chime indicated an incoming message. Murphy checked his communicator and grinned. It's from the Vorthon High Command. They're formally requesting that you accept the title of Honorary Vorthon Warrior and asking if you'd be willing to train their elite forces in human combat techniques. Maya nearly choked on her drink. They want me to train Vorthon warriors? I'm a maintenance tech, not a fighting instructor. Try explaining that to them, Murphy said. As far as they're concerned, you're the human who casually defeated their champion while complaining about workplace noise regulations. Maya shook her head and stood up, heading toward her quarters. This is getting ridiculous. I'm going to bed. Tomorrow I'm just going to fix things and try to avoid any more dramatic aliens having emotional breakdowns. The comparison to a pet lizard was the final insult Zexthul could endure. His scales flashed through a rapid sequence of colors that every species in the dining hall recognized as the prelude to lethal violence. The massive Vorthon warriors, claws extended to their full length, each one capable of tearing through metal plating, and his tail began the rhythmic thrashing that preceded a killing strike. Maya finished cleaning up her meal area and pushed her chair back from the table. The movement was casual, unhurried, like someone getting ready to leave after a pleasant dinner. She glanced around at the other diners, most of whom had pressed themselves against the far walls of the dining hall. Is there some kind of emergency going on? She asked Captain Murphy, who was halfway across the room but still close enough to hear. Everyone seems really nervous all of a sudden. Captain Murphy opened his mouth to respond, but Zexthul's roar drowned out any possibility of conversation. The sound was deafening, a primal expression of rage that seemed to shake the station's metal framework. Several smaller aliens collapsed from the sheer acoustic assault. Zexthul loomed over Maya, his shadow covering her completely. At his full height, with his crest extended, he stood nearly 9 feet tall and weighed close to 400 pounds of muscle, scale, and predatory instinct. His yellow eyes blazed with murderous intent as he began speaking in the ancient Vorthon death tongue. The words were older and more formal than his previous challenge, each syllable dripping with ceremonial menace. This was the ritual recitation that preceded execution. a sacred Vorthon tradition that granted the condemned a final moment to hear their fate before death claimed them. Maya looked up at Zexthul with the same expression she might use when someone was giving her directions to the hardware store. She waited patiently for him to finish his speech, occasionally nodding as if she were following along with the general meaning. "I will tear the fragile Deathworlder limb from limb," Zexthul declared, switching back to English so his victim could understand her doom. "I will demonstrate why Vorthons are the apex predators of this galaxy. Your pathetic human bones will crack like dry twigs in my claws." Maya glanced at her wrist chronometer and made a small sound of annoyance. "Look, buddy, I'm trying to eat here, and you're being pretty loud about it. Could you maybe keep it down a bit? Also, you've got something stuck in your teeth." The casual interruption in the middle of a formal death threat was so unexpected that Zexthul actually stopped mid-sentence. His mouth hung open as he tried to process what had just happened. Around the dining hall, the watching aliens made sounds of amazement and horror. "Furthermore," Zexthul continued, his voice rising to compensate for the interruption, "I shall display your broken corpse as a warning to any other humans who dare to show such disrespect to the Vorthon Empire. Your species will learn that Maya" stood up with a heavy sigh, the sound expressing the deep weariness of someone whose lunch break was being interrupted by nonsense. The movement brought her to roughly chest height on the towering alien warrior, which still left her looking up at him considerably. "Oh, for crying out loud," she said, brushing imaginary crumbs off her coveralls. "Do you have any idea how much paperwork I'll have to fill out if you keep making threats like that? The safety office is going to want incident reports, witness statements, probably a full psychological evaluation." Zexthul blinked in confusion, his death threat forgotten in the face of Maya's bureaucratic concerns. "What are you talking about, human?" "Workplace violence policies," Maya explained matter-of-factly. "Station Regulation 47B clearly states that verbal threats against personnel constitute a hostile work environment. I'm going to have to report this to my supervisor, and then he'll have to report it to Station Command. And before you know it, there'll be meetings and committees and probably some kind of mandatory sensitivity training." The Vorthon warriors' scales shifted to a confused purple color that none of the watching aliens had ever seen before. "I am offering you honorable death in combat, not filing a complaint with your bureaucracy." Maya shook her head sadly. "See, that's exactly the kind of attitude that leads to these problems. Back home, we had this saying about people who couldn't settle their differences without making a big scene. We called them drama queens." Zexthul's confusion instantly transformed back into rage. His claws slashed through the air as he resumed, his threatening posture looming over Maya with renewed murderous intent. "Your disrespect ends now, pathetic human. I will crush your fragile bones and feast on your terror." "Look," Maya said, her voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to a slow child. "I get that you're upset about something. Maybe you're having a bad day. Maybe someone didn't invite you to their birthday party. I don't know. But taking it out on the maintenance staff isn't going to solve your problems." She paused and looked around the dining hall where hundreds of aliens were watching in stunned silence. "Plus, you're making a scene in front of all these nice people who just wanted to have dinner? That's not very considerate." Zexthul's tail lashed violently, knocking over several empty tables. "I am Zexthul, First Claw of the Vorthon Empire, Destroyer of the Kepler Rebellion, Terror of 1,000 worlds. When I speak of death, it is not an idle threat." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "That's a pretty impressive resume. But right now, you're just a guy yelling at someone who fixes broken equipment for a living. And honestly, it's getting kind of embarrassing. The casual dismissal hit Zexthul like a physical blow. His yellow eyes widened with shock and outrage as he processed the complete lack of fear or respect in Maya's response. Around the dining hall, aliens began making soft sounds of amazement and terror. "You dare!" Zexthul began, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "To dismiss the combat challenge of a Vortan warrior?" "I'm not dismissing anything," Maya replied reasonably. "I'm just pointing out that threatening people during their lunch break is kind of rude, and also that you still have something stuck in your teeth. Right there, in the front." Zexthul's claws flexed unconsciously as he struggled to maintain his composure. "I will demonstrate the price of such insolence. Prepare to die, human." Maya looked at him for a long moment, her expression shifting from patience to mild irritation. It was the same look she used to give her brothers when they got too rowdy during family dinners. "You know what?" she said, stepping closer to the towering alien warrior. "I've been working double shifts all week. I finally got a few minutes to grab something to eat, and you've been nothing but noise and drama since the moment you walked in here." Zexthul drew himself up to his full, imposing height, his claws raised and ready to strike. "Your last words should be an apology for your disrespect, not more of your pathetic—" Maya moved faster than most of the watching aliens could track. Her hands shot out and grabbed Zexthul by the shoulders, her grip finding purchase on the joints of his ceremonial armor. Before the massive warrior could react, she pulled him down while simultaneously bringing her knee up in a precise strike to his spine. The sound echoed through the dining hall like a gunshot. Zexthul's roar of pain and shock was cut short as his nervous system registered the devastating impact. The 8-foot warrior, terror of 1,000 worlds, crumpled to the deck like a broken doll. Maya stepped back and brushed her hands off. On her coveralls, looking down at the paralyzed Vorthon with mild satisfaction. "There we go," she said. "Much quieter now." The next few days on Nexus 7 passed in a strange rhythm for Maya Rodriguez. She woke up each morning, grabbed breakfast from the human quarters, and went about her maintenance duties as if she were still back home in Australia. The only real difference was that instead of dealing with broken water pumps and generator repairs, she was fixing alien technology that hummed and glowed in ways that Earth machines never did. What Maya didn't notice, but everyone else on the station did, was how the other species reacted to her presence. Wherever she went, conversations stopped and aliens turned to stare. Some backed away when she approached, while others followed at a respectful distance, watching her every move with fascination. The betting pools had started on her second day. The insect-like Chithan were offering odds on how long the tiny Deathworlder would last before showing fear. The plant-like Verdani were taking bets on whether she would challenge Zexthul to single combat. Even the peaceful blue Aquari were wagering on what kind of primitive earth weapons she might be hiding in her tool bag. Maya remained completely oblivious to all of this. She was too busy enjoying the work and the strange new environment. The technology was fascinating, even if the people running it seemed oddly nervous all the time. Zexthul, on the other hand, was not oblivious at all. The Vorthon warrior had spent the last 3 days watching the human from a distance, studying her movements and behavior. What he saw confused and infuriated him in equal measure. The human showed no signs of the respect and fear that every other species demonstrated toward Vorthons. She walked through the station corridors with casual confidence, nodding politely to aliens that would normally prostrate themselves before Zexthul's presence. She ate foods that would poison most galactic species without any apparent concern. Most insulting of all, she seemed to have completely forgotten their first encounter. On the fourth day, Zexthul decided to escalate his campaign of intimidation. He began showing up wherever Maya was working, looming over her with his full 8-foot height and flexing his razor-sharp claws. He would speak loudly about Vorthon military victories and the weak species his people had eliminated from the galaxy. Maya continued to find his behavior mildly annoying, but not particularly threatening. While she rewired a food processor in the station's main cafeteria, Zexthul positioned himself directly behind her, describing in graphic detail how Vorthon warriors had conquered the methane moons of Kepler-7. The screams of the defeated echoed. "Across 3-star systems," Zexthul rumbled, his claws clicking together rhythmically. "Their pathetic weapons could not pierce our scales." Maya paused in her work and looked over her shoulder at him. "You know, you remind me of this old bull I used to know back home. Big fellow, always making noise and showing off. Turned out, he was mostly bluster, though. Once I figured out he was just trying to impress the cows, he wasn't so scary anymore." The cafeteria fell completely silent. Every alien present turned to stare at Maya and Zexthul. A Chithan waitress dropped her tray with a loud crash. Zexthul's scales shifted to a deeper, angrier shade of green. "You dare compare me to some barnyard animal?" "Well, the similarities are pretty obvious," Maya said, turning back to her work. "Big, loud, lots of posturing, probably never been in a real fight. The bull at least was useful for breeding." A collective gasp went up from the watching aliens. Some species that Maya couldn't identify started making what sounded like prayers to their gods. Others began quietly backing toward the exits. Zexthul leaned closer, his breath hot against the back of Maya's neck. "I have killed more enemies than you have years of life, human." "That's nice," Maya replied absently, focused on a particularly stubborn connection. "Back home, we had this saying about people who talk too much about their fighting days. Empty cans make the most noise." The insult was so casual, so completely without malice, that it somehow made it even more devastating. Zexthul's tail began lashing violently, and his claws extended to their full length. Captain Murphy chose that moment to enter the cafeteria, took one look at the scene, and immediately tried to approach diplomatically. "Perhaps we should all take a step back and the human will learn respect," Zexthul snarled, not taking his eyes off Maya. "Or she will learn pain." Maya finally turned around to face him, wiping her hands on her coveralls. "Look, I get that. You're trying to do some kind of tough guy routine here, but I'm on a schedule. I've got 6 more food processors to check today, and then the air recyclers in Section D need their monthly cleaning. You think your maintenance duties matter more than showing proper deference to a Vorthon warrior?" Zexthul demanded. Maya considered this seriously for a moment. "Yeah, pretty much. See, when the air recyclers break down, people die. When tough guys don't get enough attention, they just sulk a lot. Basic priorities." Zexthul's roar of rage echoed through the cafeteria, causing several smaller aliens to faint outright. His claws slashed through the air inches from Maya's face, leaving gouges in the metal wall behind her. Maya glanced at the claw marks and shook her head disapprovingly. "Great. Now I'll have to patch those up, too. You know, back home we had this phrase about people who broke other people's stuff when they got angry. We called them toddlers." The watching aliens couldn't believe what they were hearing. Some had started recording the exchange to show others who wouldn't believe the story. Others were placing frantic bets on how long Maya had left to live. "Captain," Murphy was slowly reaching for his communication device, probably to call security or medical assistance, when Maya did something that surprised everyone. She yawned. "Look, Zexthul, right?" she said, checking the name tag on his armor. "I'm sure you're very important and scary and all that, but I really need to get back to work. The station commander wants all maintenance completed by end of shift, and I don't like to disappoint my boss." Zexthul stood frozen in shock. In over 50 years of military service, no enemy had ever dismissed him so completely. Species that had fought Vorthans to the death had still shown more fear and respect than this small human female. Maya picked up her tool bag and started walking toward the exit. As she passed Zexthul, she patted his arm in what might have been meant as a comforting gesture. "Maybe try taking up a hobby or something. All that anger can't be good for your blood pressure." After Maya left, the cafeteria remained silent for nearly a full minute. Zexthul stood motionless, his claws still extended, his scales cycling through various shades of green and yellow. Finally, he turned and stalked out without saying another word. The betting pools immediately exploded with new activity. Some aliens were convinced that Maya was secretly the most dangerous warrior in human history, hiding her true nature behind a facade of casual indifference. Others believed she was simply too primitive to understand the danger she was in. "Captain." Murphy collapsed into the nearest chair and ordered the strongest drink the cafeteria could provide. He was beginning to understand that Maya Rodriguez was going to change everything about humanity's relationship with the galaxy, whether she meant to or not.